When Margaret Fielding unwrapped a long-forgotten envelope containing a Swiss train ticket dated July 3, 1946, she never expected it to unravel the final threads of the life she believed she had already made peace with. Decades after Thomas disappeared, a passport under a strange name and an aging photograph revealed a truth she had once deemed impossible: that he hadn't abandoned her at all, but had been taken by forces neither of them could control. The discovery of a hidden daughter and the shadowy machinery of a secret war shattered the silence she had carried for 75 years. Stay until the end. What would you do if the person you loved most had vanished for your own safety? Margaret was 98 years old by the time she found the package on her doorstep. She lived alone in a modest cottage in Vermont, a place she had chosen for its serenity and long, snowy winters, which somehow eased the ache of memory. Her days fell into a gentle rhythm that she rarely disturbed. Mornings meant a soft, measured start. Shuffling slippers, the whir of a teapot, the faint crackle of an old radio station she turned on more for company than for information. On good days, she would step outside around mid-morning, stoop to pinch away dead buds in a flower bed that never seemed to flourish, then circle the house, scanning the horizon for something that never appeared. She had been widowed twice. Her second husband, Richard, had been kind, an upstanding man who offered her as much comfort as a friend could. Margaret tried, on 2 separate occasions, to love again, but found herself comparing every passing hour to the morning of July 2, 1946, when Thomas Fielding, her first husband, held her hand on a platform in Pittsburgh and kissed her goodbye. He was tall and lean, fresh back from the war, exuding that particular brand of confidence men his age carried after surviving what felt like the end of the world. They had been married only a few months. He was supposed to arrive in Chicago for a job interview at an engineering firm. Then he would send for her. She remembered him whispering into her hair that it was just the beginning, just the start of a new life for them both. 3 weeks later, the telegram arrived. No arrival record for Thomas Fielding. Presumed missing. No further inquiry. The world had told her to move on. The war was over, but men changed. Some vanished for reasons better left unspoken. Yet Margaret knew Thomas down to the gentle way he touched her wrist. He would never have disappeared on his own. She had spent decades clinging to that certainty, even while the rest of her life trudged forward. She wore that conviction like a second heartbeat, a nearly silent pulse that only she could feel. By the time she reached her late 90s, she had almost resigned herself to an incomplete story. Sometimes she thought of herself like a character in a novel whose final chapters had been torn out. Let the rest of the world say what it wanted. She knew her truth, even if she had no proof. She might have gone to her grave that way, if not for the unassuming package that appeared on her doorstep one crisp autumn morning. She was returning from a neighborly chat with her part-time caregiver, arms weighed down with a brown paper bag of groceries. The sight of the package at her front step startled her. There was no postage, no sign of who had dropped it off. She paused, set her groceries down, and picked up the small parcel. Her name, Margaret Fielding, was scrawled on a yellowed label. That handwriting immediately set her heart in an uneven patter. She didn't recognize it, yet something about it felt like a message from the past. She brought it inside, into the warmth of her living room. After fussing with the kettle for tea, she sat down by the window. She turned the package over in her hands, searching for any clue of its origin. Her mind filled with all the possibilities. A scam? A misguided delivery? Or perhaps, though she hardly dared to dream, some stray piece of closure at last? Inside the box lay a single envelope and several documents. She removed them gingerly, eyes widening at what she saw. A Swiss train ticket, edges brittle with age, dated July 3, 1946. A passport from Geneva, the photograph inside marred by decades of wear. The name? Franklin Ward. And beneath the passport, there was a letter, the handwriting delicate and slanted, a style she knew all too well. My dearest M, if you're reading this, then time has finally allowed it. I never boarded the train to Chicago. I boarded a different one, for a different reason. I never stopped loving you. T. Her heartbeat thumped so loudly in her ears that she wondered if she might faint. She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, blinking at the swirl of confusion before her. Thomas's letter. She had memorized his handwriting from the many letters he wrote during the war. Letters she kept in a locked drawer, their edges gone soft from her fingers tracing them all these years. That same flourish on the capital T was unmistakable. But what was this Swiss train ticket? And who was Franklin Ward? She reread the note over and over until she had it committed to memory, tears sliding down her cheeks in silent amazement. She laid the passport on her lap and studied the faded black and white photograph. The face looked only somewhat like Thomas. The shape of the jaw was right, the determined set of the mouth. But the hair was trimmed shorter, and the expression was guarded, as if the man in the picture were preparing for a life he never wanted. That night she could hardly sleep. She sat in her rocking chair well past midnight, the letter in her lap, a single lamp illuminating her puzzle. How on earth had this package reached her doorstep 75 years after Thomas vanished? Who had placed it there? She felt a flicker of anger. Why reveal this now, after all this time? Why keep her in the dark, forcing her to question her own memories? But a deeper emotion soon eclipsed the anger. Hope. If Thomas had written this letter, maybe it meant she had been right to believe he would never simply walk away from her. Maybe he was forced into something bigger than he could control. She decided to call Beverly, the new librarian who lived a few doors down and often helped Margaret with the internet when she needed it. Beverly was in her 40s, bright-eyed, good with computers, and well-versed in local and international archives. Margaret hated to impose, but she knew she needed help. The local library was the best resource she had on short notice. Beverly arrived the next morning, a laptop tucked under her arm. She listened with a sympathetic ear as Margaret recounted the entire story of Thomas's disappearance, her voice trembling at times with grief and the faint spark of new possibility. Beverly handled the passport with great care, scanning the pages with her phone to magnify the details. They found stamps from Switzerland, something referencing Basel, and a date, 1949. No U.S. stamps, no mention of Thomas Fielding. It looked authentic, though certain sections were in French and German. They began their online search in the small dining area of Margaret's cottage. The smell of tea and the faint chill of a Vermont breeze set the mood as they pored over old records. Beverly's brow furrowed as she navigated historical immigration archives, genealogical databases, any resource that might contain a clue about Franklin Ward. For the first few hours, they uncovered nothing that tied that name to any known public figure. Then Margaret hesitantly mentioned how Thomas spoke fluent German. He had been part of an army intelligence unit, decoding transmissions in Europe. That recollection made Beverly look up with a sharp, discerning gaze. That might be important, she said. After the war, some U.S. agencies were recruiting people with specialized language skills and cryptographic knowledge, especially around, well, I recall something about classified programs that brought German scientists to the States. Operation Paperclip, Margaret whispered, surprising herself with the memory. I've read that name in passing but never paid it much attention. They searched for more details on Operation Paperclip. The official programs were partly declassified, but many documents had long since vanished or were heavily redacted. They found references to Swiss intermediaries, espionage, the reassigning of certain individuals under new identities. The deeper they dug, the more it felt like peering into a labyrinth where every corridor branched into more questions. Beverly read out a snippet. Certain ghost identities were created to facilitate secure escorts and intelligence gathering in Europe, often involving German scientists, nuclear secrets, and the forging of new identities to keep the entire affair clandestine. Margaret's heart thudded as she realized the gravity of the path they were taking. If Thomas had been involved with something so secret, could that explain his abrupt disappearance? Perhaps the original plan to head to Chicago was a convenient cover story. Maybe the phone call from the recruiting agents had come at the worst possible time, forcing him to vanish without a word, for reasons far beyond his control. She felt anger stir, though muted by the years. The anger that he hadn't found a way to tell her. But as the day wore on, she reminded herself that the letter implied he was compelled, that he had no choice, and that pang of longing for him, that love she had never truly left behind, overshadowed her anger. She and Beverly continued their search over the next few days. They found scattered mentions of a Franklin W. in newspaper archives from Switzerland, referencing a U.S.-backed scientific research commission in Basel late 1940s. The articles were cryptic, likely censored, but a pattern emerged, describing men of unknown origin, possessing official credentials from the U.S. yet living under assumed identities. None were named outright, but enough details matched up with the Operation Paperclip rumors to make the hair on Margaret's neck stand on end. Beverly placed a late-night phone call to a history professor in Zurich who specialized in post-war intelligence. He spoke with excitement at the mention of Franklin Ward, explaining that the alias was indeed known to historians who studied early Cold War espionage. The professor was almost giddy at the prospect of new evidence, especially if they could provide any documents from the passport. "You see," he told Beverly in a thickly accented voice over speakerphone, "we always suspected Ward was not a real name. It was used by multiple individuals to smuggle or escort people, or possibly to conduct classified transactions." Margaret listened, her heart pounding. She felt a complicated brew of validation and dread. If Thomas had become Franklin Ward, it meant he was deeply entwined in something dangerous, something that spanned continents. She stayed up that night, recalling every small detail from the day he left. She fixated on how calm he had seemed, how he'd kissed her goodbye with such tenderness. Looking back, she wondered if he'd known then that he might never see her again. By the fifth day, Margaret was exhausted, physically and emotionally, but also determined. Beverly suggested they go further, contact archivists in Geneva. Margaret hesitated. She was 98. The mere thought of traveling to Switzerland felt overwhelming. But the more she waited, the more she realized that she might never have another chance to resolve the single greatest question of her life. Her second husband had passed away without ever getting answers for her. She had no children, no immediate family to tie her down. In a moment of clarity, she realized the only thing holding her back was fear of the unknown. What was left to fear, though, when she was so close to the twilight of her life? She called Beverly early in the morning, her voice trembling with unspoken resolve. "I'm going," she said. "I'm flying to Geneva." Beverly, stunned, tried to ensure Margaret understood the difficulties of a transatlantic flight. But Margaret was resolute. She had some savings left and she needed this answer more than anything else. Within a week, she had arranged for a passport renewal, something she hadn't needed in decades, and booked a flight. Beverly insisted on accompanying her, but Margaret refused, fearing she would be a burden. Instead, Beverly helped her set up ground assistance for seniors, ensuring someone would help her through each airport. Margaret packed a small suitcase with only essentials: warm clothes, a few photographs of Thomas, his old war letters, and a battered diary in which she used to write small notes to him after he disappeared, as though she believed he might read them someday. The flight was disorienting. She hadn't been on a plane in nearly 45 years, yet she found a sense of excitement pulsing beneath her frail exterior. It felt as if she were stepping out of time, crossing an invisible barrier between the life she had known and the truth she had sought for so long. Her joints ached, and the noise of the aircraft rattled her nerves, but she pressed on. When she arrived at Geneva's airport, an official from the small historical museum outside the city greeted her. His name was Luke, an archivist who had corresponded with Beverly over email. He was middle-aged, spoke English with a lilting accent, and handled Margaret with genuine warmth. He guided her past the bustle of arrivals, helped her collect her luggage, and led her to a modest hotel by the lakeside. There, he explained in halting but kind words that the museum he worked at was once a Red Cross hospital. Now it held records of certain post-war patients. If indeed her Thomas had used the name Franklin Ward, there was a chance they had something on file. Margaret barely slept that night, gazing out her window at the lights reflecting on Lake Geneva. She felt the weight of every passing year pressing on her chest, as though she might be moving underwater. But there was no turning back. In the morning, Luke drove her out of the city to the decommissioned hospital, which still bore the emblem of the Red Cross on its exterior. Portions of the building had been converted into a museum, but other wings remained closed to the public. Inside, the corridors smelled of old books and damp stone. Luke took her to a quiet room at the back, where a frail older man named Emile awaited them. He introduced himself as a former archivist, retired but called in for special cases. She handed him a copy of the passport and the letter from Thomas. Emile's hand trembled as he read. He excused himself to go through the restricted shelves and returned some minutes later, carrying a leather-bound folder. He laid it carefully on the table, explaining that it was marked with a single reference to F. Ward in an old admission ledger. Margaret's hands shook as she opened it. The folder contained patient records from 1959, a report of a car crash near Geneva, suspected to involve a surveillance operation gone wrong. The occupant of the car was admitted under the name Franklin Ward, with injuries including a fractured rib and a concussion. He stayed for several months, receiving quiet visits from individuals who never signed the visitor log. Then, in the discharge notes, an ominous line, "No next of kin, no official records, patient is cleared for return. Observing M. from safe distance. No contact authorized." Margaret stared at the words in disbelief, her heart racing. Observing M. from a safe distance? M could only be her Margaret. The note implied Thomas had still been alive, still working under that alias, and had been actively told not to contact her. She blinked back tears that threatened to spill across the fragile paper. He had not merely vanished. He had spent years keeping watch over her in secret. Emile gently turned to the final sheet in the file, an attached photograph, dated 1964, that had been discovered among the patient's personal effects. The photograph showed a tall man in a long coat standing across the street from a New York brownstone, looking up toward a third-floor window. The angle suggested it had been taken covertly, perhaps by someone tailing him. Margaret recognized the brownstone instantly. She had lived there from 1963 to 1967 after marrying her second husband. The man in the photo was older, hair flecked with gray, but the outline of his face struck her like a thunderbolt. She had stared at that face in her dreams for years. Her legs gave out. Luke caught her just in time, helping her into a nearby chair as tears streamed down her cheeks. Everything she had suspected was true. Thomas had not left her willingly. He had been drawn into a world of espionage so dark and far-reaching that it demanded he sever all ties. For the first time in 75 years, she felt both an immense grief and an immense relief. He was not a deserter of their love. He had been protecting her. She spent the rest of the day reeling from the revelation. That evening, over a simple meal in her hotel, she tried to process the implications. The anger she had once carried burned again, but it was tempered by understanding. She thought of the years he must have spent watching her from the sidelines, seeing her remarry, seeing her laugh, weep, struggle, and grow older, all without the power to close the distance between them. She felt a deep sorrow for him. Whatever sense of duty or threat had forced him into that role must have weighed heavier than any chain. Luke and Emile offered to help Margaret track down additional information. They reached out to a few historians specializing in Cold War espionage. One of them, a woman named Corinne, recognized the alias Franklin Ward from a partial list of courier identities. Corinne believed that men like Thomas were essentially tasked with escorting or neutralizing high-priority individuals, German scientists, defectors, or ex-Nazi intelligence officers, under the broader scope of U.S. covert operations. The job involved living in the shadows, constantly at risk, reliant on sealed orders from superiors who were themselves pieces on a chessboard of global politics. Margaret felt a swirl of nausea as Corinne spoke. She imagined Thomas in those lonely corridors of foreign hotels, forging documents, speaking fluent German to men whose pasts were steeped in war. She thought about how the posture of his shoulders might have changed over time, how the tension of living a double life might have etched deeper lines into his face. At 98, she felt heartbreak in ways she hadn't known were still possible. 2 days later, as Margaret prepared to leave for Vermont, Emile gave her one last item, a business card. It belonged to a woman named Amelia Ward, who had contacted the museum months prior. She claimed to have discovered references to Franklin Ward in her late father's documents, along with mention of Margaret Fielding and an unsent letter. The archivist explained that they hadn't followed up because they couldn't connect the dots, until Margaret arrived. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Who was Amelia Ward? Could Thomas have remarried and started a new family? A swirl of emotion coursed through her. Betrayal, curiosity, excitement, fear. She was too close to the truth now to ignore it, so she dialed the number, her heart quivering with every ring. Amelia answered, her voice calm and polite. Upon hearing Margaret's name, there was a long silence. Then Amelia gently confessed that the documents she'd found suggested a connection to someone named Thomas Fielding, and she had no idea how it all fit. Margaret listened, tears slipping down her cheeks, as Amelia admitted she had grown up with a father who never spoke of his past, but sometimes mentioned a woman in hushed, regretful tones. They arranged to meet in a cafe along Lake Geneva the following afternoon. Margaret wore her best dress, a somber navy blue thing she'd brought just in case she needed something finer than her traveling clothes. She steadied herself against her cane, worried she might not manage the short walk from the taxi to the cafe without trembling. But resolve kept her upright. When she arrived, a woman in her early 60s stood to greet her, offering a polite, reserved smile. Amelia Ward had gray at her temples and wore a simple blouse and skirt. She helped Margaret settle into a chair, then sat down across from her. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, each trying to read the other's eyes. Amelia spoke first. She described how her father, a reserved man who went by Frank Ward, had been elusive about his origins. He never admitted to having had another name, but he once told her stories of a young bride he had left behind in a country across the ocean. Amelia was a teenager then, and she shrugged off his tears, not quite grasping the gravity. As years passed, she saw him read the same battered letters over and over. Eventually, she found them tucked away in his belongings, letters addressed to M. She confronted him once, on her 18th birthday, and he said, "I did it all to keep her safe. You are safe because I gave up the person I loved most." Amelia's voice trembled at the memory. Margaret had expected many emotions in that meeting, but not empathy for the man who had fathered a child with another woman, or perhaps fathered this child alone, in secrecy after leaving Margaret. She realized she wasn't even sure of Amelia's mother's identity. But as Amelia recounted her father's lifelong regret, Margaret felt tears forming. She reached out, and Amelia gently set a small wooden box on the table between them. It had an ornate clasp, the surface worn smooth by time. Amelia explained that this box held some of her father's final possessions. Among them was a letter addressed to Margaret. Hands trembling, Margaret opened it. The ink was faint, the handwriting once again that slanted, careful style she knew so well. "My dearest M, I disappeared because they told me if I didn't, you would. I was tasked with erasing men who couldn't be named, and I became one myself. I watched you for years, across streets, through fogged glass, behind doors I could never knock on. I saw you laugh again. I saw you dance once in your kitchen. That was enough. I am sorry. I was yours. I still am. Thomas." Margaret could hardly read the words through her tears. She closed her eyes, and the tension of 75 years broke all at once, tears flowing not with bitterness, but with release. She gripped Amelia's hand. Neither spoke for a long while, until Margaret managed a frail whisper. "I never stopped loving him either." Amelia's own tears glistened on her cheeks. She admitted she barely knew her father. He had been affectionate but distant, as though always looking over his shoulder for something he feared might appear. He never remarried after Amelia's mother died shortly after childbirth. Amelia was raised with a nanny, eventually going to boarding school. As an adult, she had confronted her father again about his secrets, but he would only say, "If you know the truth, it might destroy you or bring you into danger." It was only after his death that she uncovered documents referencing Margaret Fielding and realized there was a missing piece to her father's story. Sitting in that cafe, the two women forged a bond neither had expected. Margaret saw in Amelia's eyes the same quiet resilience she had loved in Thomas. Amelia, for her part, sensed that Margaret was a living connection to the father she had never truly known. They spent hours there ordering tea and coffee, glancing at the box's contents. Notes, cryptic references to places in Germany, a dog-eared photograph of Margaret and Thomas on their wedding day, and a carefully preserved telegram from 1946. Margaret felt her heart ache seeing those images, especially the wedding photo of her and Thomas radiant with youthful hope. Later that evening, Margaret returned to her hotel, her mind racing. She had so many questions. Why had Thomas never told her about Amelia? Had he thought Margaret would be hurt by the knowledge that he had a child with someone else? Or had the circumstances been more complicated? She also felt a sense of quiet joy. Even as heartbreak mingled with confusion, she realized she had gained a daughter of sorts, late in life, a living piece of Thomas's legacy. For all the sorrow, there was a glimmer of gratitude that he had not ended up alone after sacrificing so much. In the days that followed, Margaret stayed on in Geneva, meeting Amelia again and again in that lakeside cafe. They walked slowly along the water, talking of the missing years. Amelia recounted how her father would sometimes vanish for days, returning exhausted and silent. Margaret recognized it as the life of a man still under some old intelligence directive, perhaps carrying out one last duty or fearful of loose ends from decades prior. Amelia told her father's final moments. He died quietly in a private nursing facility in the outskirts of Geneva, clutching a half-written letter to Margaret that never found its way to a mailbox. Margaret's heart twisted when she heard that. She asked Amelia if, in all those years, Thomas had spoken of any regrets. Amelia only nodded. He said he had one regret bigger than all others, that he never got to hold your hand one last time and tell you the truth himself. One crisp afternoon, Margaret gathered the courage to take a train ride to Basel with Amelia, wanting to see the city where Thomas had apparently operated for a time. Their conversation drifted between the mundane and the profound. Favorite foods, old war stories, the cost of secrets. Basel itself was a quiet city, a mix of medieval architecture and modern lines. They located an old building that once housed a scientific research commission, according to the records Beverly had sent them. Now it was an apartment complex. Margaret gazed at its facade, imagining Thomas stepping in and out of its doors, carrying coded documents or forging alliances with men who once wore the uniform of the enemy. She felt pride and sorrow intertwined. Pride in his dedication, sorrow for the price they both paid. That evening, they shared dinner at a little restaurant near the Rhine. The water shimmered in the moonlight, and Margaret felt the weight of her age. Yet she also felt a remarkable newness, as though she had stepped into a final chapter of her life that offered both closure and fresh beginnings. Amelia, too, seemed to sense the significance of the moment. Over dessert, she revealed she had no children of her own and that, in a strange way, meeting Margaret gave her a sense of belonging she had never experienced before. They toasted quietly to Thomas, to his sacrifice, and to the improbable thread that now connected them. A few days later, Margaret knew it was time to fly home. Her body was tired, and her mind felt saturated with new truths. Amelia planned to visit her in Vermont the following year. They parted with an embrace at the airport, tears in both their eyes. Amelia slipped a small photograph into Margaret's hand at the last minute. A snapshot of Amelia at around age 5, with her father kneeling beside her on a lush green lawn. Margaret held the picture close to her heart as she boarded the plane, her mind swirling with awe at how life could open such doors so late. Back in Vermont, the cottage felt the same and yet transformed. The garden still refused to bloom in any spectacular fashion. The old radio still crackled with static, but Margaret carried an unexpected peace. She told Beverly every detail of the trip, from the moment she met Amelia to the hush of old museum corridors. Beverly was ecstatic, hugging Margaret gently. "You did it," Beverly said, eyes shining. "You found your answers." But Margaret wasn't entirely certain she had. Yes, she now knew that Thomas had never abandoned her out of callousness. She knew about Operation Paperclip, about espionage, about how he'd watched her from a distance. She even knew he had fathered a daughter whose mother remained a mystery, and that he had lived the rest of his days with Margaret's name forever on his lips. Still, Margaret wondered if some aspects of Thomas would always remain hidden. She sensed that he had carried secrets too dark to speak of and that, in the end, might have consumed parts of him she would never understand. Days turned into weeks as she settled back into her routine. She found herself rereading Thomas's war letters, then carefully placing them side by side with the new documents Amelia had given her. She even pinned up the covert photograph from 1964, the one showing Thomas gazing at her old New York apartment from across the street. Each time she walked by it, she felt a pang of gratitude, tinged with sadness. He'd been there, a silent sentinel, never to knock on her door but never truly gone. Then, one afternoon, she received a letter from Amelia. It contained an old medical notice that Amelia had found among her father's effects, indicating he had survived a second crash. This one in the early 1970s, location unspecified. There was a note scribbled on the margin of that record. 2. Ensure M is safe. Do not approach. The text was a painful reminder that, even in the face of near death, Thomas's priority had been Margaret's well-being over his own desire to see her. She stared at the slip of paper for a long time, unsure whether to cry or to smile. As winter crept in, the Vermont snows blanketed her cottage. The hush of the season gave Margaret time to reflect. Some nights, she would take out the letter Thomas had addressed to her from Amelia's box, the one in which he confessed that he had been tasked with erasing men who couldn't be named and had become one of them himself. She tried to imagine what such a life entailed. Forging passports, crossing borders under false pretenses, burying the name Thomas Fielding so deep that eventually the world assumed him lost or dead. She pictured him standing in the gloom of an alley, wearing that long coat from the 1964 photo, lighting a cigarette he never finished. The thought that he might have glimpsed her silhouette through the window, or heard her laugh through a crack in the door, cut her to the core. Yet it also filled her with a strange comfort. Sometimes, in the hush of early morning, she would speak aloud to him, as though his spirit lingered in that very room. "It's all right," she would say softly. "I understand. You did what you had to do." The words felt healing, as though forging a last connection across the bridge of time. She soon realized that her story had taken on a different shape. It was no longer a single question, "Where did you go?" but a tapestry of shared pain and quiet devotion. She saw how Thomas had chosen her safety over his freedom, how he had given Amelia a life far removed from the dangers of his espionage. In the end, the cost was staggering, but love had never truly vanished. It had just worn a different face, a distant shadow across a lifetime. Margaret decided to do something special with her newfound perspective. She began recording short tapes on an old cassette recorder that Beverly found for her. She wanted to leave behind a spoken testament, a chance for others, maybe even Amelia, to hear directly about the man she loved. She talked about how she'd met Thomas at a local dance in 1945, how he'd borrowed a friend's suit that was too big for him, how he'd spun her around until she laughed. She recounted their whirlwind courtship, the war letters that spanned oceans, the hush of the crowd at their wedding. She tried to describe the hope they felt on July 2, 1946, believing everything lay ahead. By Christmas, she had a small stack of these tapes, each labeled with a date. Beverly listened to a few, teary-eyed. Margaret couldn't tell if they served as a final goodbye or a new beginning, but she felt compelled to make sense of her own memories. She sent a few duplicates to Amelia, who wrote back expressing gratitude, saying it was a privilege to learn about her father from someone who loved him so deeply. That winter, Margaret's health declined. She found herself short of breath more often, her knees weaker, her doctor gently suggesting she keep some oxygen nearby. She accepted these signs with a quiet grace. Even as her body weakened, she discovered a sense of peace she had never known. She believed that, at last, she understood how Thomas's love had never really left her. The telegram from 1946 was an untruth. He was not missing, he was simply unseen. On a clear night in February, a soft knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find Amelia standing there, luggage in hand, tears in her eyes. "I needed to see you," Amelia said simply. Margaret embraced her without hesitation, ushering her inside and making tea. For a few days, Amelia stayed in that cozy cottage, and the two shared stories. Amelia helped Margaret sort through old photographs, labeling them properly. They listened to Margaret's cassette recordings, sitting side by side on the couch, occasionally laughing at some silly anecdote about Thomas's sense of humor or his crooked grin. One evening, as a gentle snow drifted outside, Amelia asked Margaret about her regrets. Margaret thought quietly, then admitted she regretted believing, even for a moment, that Thomas had simply abandoned her. She wished she could have had faith in him more deeply, but war had taught them all not to trust the world so easily. Amelia nodded. Then she revealed her own regret, that she had never truly pressed her father for the truth while he was alive, that she had let him shield her rather than insist on understanding the man he was. They consoled each other, each realizing that regret was simply love in another form, yearning for more time together. The winter melted into spring, and Amelia left to tie up affairs in Geneva, promising she would return to Vermont soon. Margaret's health continued to waver, yet she clung on, determined to see another bloom in her garden, however lackluster. She spent her days outside in the mild sunshine, leaning on her cane, checking the damp soil. She felt closer to Thomas under that open sky. Sometimes she would place a small stool near the wilted plants, close her eyes, and recall the day he first kissed her, how she could almost smell the starch on his uniform. Word began to spread through the local community about Margaret's story. Some neighbors found it romantic, others whispered about government conspiracies. A local reporter came by requesting an interview, but Margaret politely declined, wanting to preserve the privacy of Thomas's sacrifice. She agreed only to share her story with a small historical society that promised to keep personal details confidential. She felt it might help other families who lost loved ones to secret wartime missions. One late afternoon, Beverly visited with a letter in hand. It was from the U.S. government, more specifically, from a retired intelligence official who had caught wind of Margaret's inquiry into Franklin Ward. The official, a man named Samuel Hollings, offered sparse details but confirmed that Ward was an operative of some significance in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Hollings added that many documents regarding Ward's missions were sealed, and that it might be best for Margaret's own sake to let sleeping dogs lie. The letter ended with a cryptic sentence. He did what he did to protect everyone involved, especially you. The full story may be more painful than you realize. Margaret folded the letter carefully. She felt a pang, another warning to leave it alone. But her curiosity had already been sated enough by the truths she'd found. She'd uncovered the heart of Thomas's disappearance. He did it out of love, forced into a labyrinth of shadows he couldn't escape. Perhaps there were more details of missions, or dangerous men he'd hunted, or deals he'd brokered. But those details, she realized, no longer mattered to her. She had found the essential answer. He had never stopped loving her. Summer arrived, bringing lush greenery to Vermont. Amelia returned for a longer stay, renting a small house nearby so she could look after Margaret more closely. They passed leisurely days sharing quiet meals, exchanging stories of their separate lives, forging a relationship that felt almost like mother and daughter. Margaret sometimes told Amelia that she wished they'd had decades together, but Amelia would shake her head gently and say, "We have now. That's all that matters." In the early hours of one warm July morning, Margaret awakened from a dream in which she was dancing with Thomas at their wedding reception. The music in the dream still lingered in her ears, a sweet, lilting tune. She sat up, feeling an odd serenity. She scribbled a final entry in her diary. "I found him. After all these years, I found him in the shadows where he kept me safe. And I found the daughter I never knew I had. Perhaps this is enough for one lifetime." Over the next few days, her health took a sharp decline. Amelia grew concerned, calling the local doctor. Margaret quietly insisted she was ready for whatever came next. One afternoon, as she lay in bed, she asked Amelia to open the curtains so she could watch the garden. A single blossom, delicate and pink, had appeared where Margaret had spent so many hours tending the soil. She smiled at the sight, tears welling up. That evening, Amelia read Thomas's final letter aloud to Margaret, the letter from the wooden box, letting each word wash over them both. Margaret's breathing was shallow, her eyes half closed, but she managed to smile. After Amelia finished, Margaret whispered, "He came home to me in a way. He never left." Then she closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling her into slumber. In the quiet moments that followed, Amelia held Margaret's hand, tears slipping onto the bedsheets. Margaret's breath grew fainter, each inhalation more fragile than the last. Shortly before dawn, she passed away peacefully, as though following the melody of that wedding dance in her dreams. Amelia, grief-stricken, found solace in the diaries and the tapes Margaret had made. She spent the next weeks finalizing arrangements, planning a modest service that Margaret would have appreciated. Neighbors gathered to pay respects, speaking kindly of the old woman who had carried an unspoken sorrow for most of her life. Beverly helped sort Margaret's belongings, carefully preserving the letters, documents, and the cassette recordings. News of Margaret's passing reached distant ears. Months later, Amelia received a package from a Swiss address she didn't recognize. Inside was a small collection of declassified intelligence files, apparently more scraps related to Franklin Ward. Whether it was from some remorseful official or a distant historian, Amelia never discovered. The documents shed a bit more light on Thomas's missions, referencing high-level escorts of German scientists to U.S.-controlled zones, clandestine meetings in post-war Europe. But they offered no earth-shattering revelations beyond what Margaret had already deduced. Amelia read them with a heavy heart, her eyes snagging on one last unmarked photograph. A candid shot of Thomas in the late 1950s, looking tired and older than his years, paused mid-conversation with a man in a lab coat. Amelia felt an ache for the father she wished she had truly known, for the mother figure Margaret had become at the very end. But she also felt gratitude. Against the long odds of history and secrecy, Margaret had found her. They had made peace with the man who tied their lives together. Months turned into years. Amelia became a guardian of the story. She visited Vermont often, maintaining Margaret's cottage as a retreat from the bustling world. One day, she hoped to open it to the public in some small capacity, a place to share the quiet proof that even amid war, espionage, and decades of silence, love can persist. She would invite historians to see the letters, to marvel at how a single train ticket dated July 3, 1946, could change an entire life. She never tried to turn the story into a public spectacle. She followed Margaret's example, protecting Thomas's legacy. But she did keep one promise. She left a few subtle hints in genealogical records and donated partial documents to an archive under sealed conditions, so that future researchers might stumble upon the name Franklin Ward and push further, curious, and perhaps discover that heroism sometimes lives in the hearts of men who can never claim recognition. In the end, Margaret's legacy was neither grand nor famous. Her obituary in the local paper mentioned that she was once the wife of a missing World War II veteran, that she had no direct descendants, overlooking the existence of Amelia by mutual agreement, and that she left behind diaries and letters chronicling a remarkable, if private, story. Those who knew her best understood the quiet power of what she had accomplished in her final months. Even when the final answers once brought pain, they ultimately set Margaret's heart free, filling her days with the joy of newfound love and reconciliation. In discovering that Thomas had chosen her over certainty, she realized his love had never truly left her. It had simply taken a different form, one that brought her the precious gift of family. With Amelia's arrival, Margaret reclaimed the life she thought was lost, and together they transformed old sorrows into a bright promise of tomorrow. Margaret's legacy became a celebration of love's enduring power, a reminder that even after the deepest loss, happiness can bloom anew. With every new day, she embraced life with gratitude, cherishing the unexpected gifts that reunited her with the spirit of Thomas and the loving presence of her daughter. How would you celebrate the beauty of love's unexpected gifts, knowing that every heartache can lead to a joyful, complete family? Thanks so much for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more.